guys, for having me here at your conference. It's been very good fun so far. I'm Pieter. Surname a bit more difficult, but if you really want to pronounce it, yes, it's van der Pijl. I'm here with a company called Triple Dragon, together with Charlie, that's the guy sitting over there. And we're from London, and we came to Kiev to meet game developers, publishers, and speak with them, see their games. So if you have questions, please do ask them at the Q&A session. And if you have questions after that, please do come and see us. That's why we're here. I already have had quite a few meetings with developers here, and also had a few developers randomly popping up, asking, "Well, can I show you my game?" Yes, of course. Ask me or ask Charlie if you bump into us. So we're here to talk and to explain a bit more about user acquisition financing and what it is and what it does. But before going into detail on user acquisition finance, it's probably good to explain a little bit what are typically the funding sources that are available for game developers. And because I don't quite know sort of like whether you're small indies or part of a bigger developer, can we do a quick show of hands? Who here in the audience is working for a game developer? Yep, and just to get a feel for split between mobile and PC, who's doing mobile? Who's doing PC and consoles? Yeah, okay, so it seems to be majority mobile, which is fine. I mean, we cover both. So getting back to the topic of how do you get funded as a game developer? There's various different funding sources. One is, of course, equity, which we would typically call, I mean, where would you raise that, in what kind of rounds? That's what we call FFF, friends, families, and fools. Seed rounds, angel rounds, and when you get further on, sort of like in your life as game development business, you'll be start to look at Series A, Series B rounds from venture capital firms. Equity you would typically use very, very much early on when you start to sort of like fund the actual development and prototyping of your games. Then the next funding source, and that's sort of where we start to come in, is debt or loans. You can look at bank debt or venture debt or loans from specialized game funding companies such as Triple Dragon. We'll explain in more detail in the next couple of slides sort of like what it is and how it works and whether it is sort of like suitable for your studio. The next one is one that sits a little bit in between, project financing. So what is it? It's not an investment in your company, in your business as a game studio, but it's an investment where someone else basically shares risks and provides funding so that you can make your game, and it's typically done on some sort of revenue share mechanism. I've also highlighted a few other sort of like funding sources. Not all of them are always that great, but I mentioned them anyway. Crowdfunding is something that has been used by a few developers very successfully. It's also been used, or many game developers have tried to use it and failed miserably. It's very sort of volatile. The other one is grants, and this really depends in sort of like the country where you're operating. But in some countries, grant funding is available, and it's actually quite generous. Certainly countries like Finland, Poland, the UK, lots of opportunities there. So sometimes it can actually make sense to work together with a studio there because it will give you access to grant funding. Same thing with tax credits. The other one that I sometimes see is what I call tulip bulbs. I see game developers popping up with, oh, we're going to do an ICO or we're going to issue crypto. I'm not a big fan of that, but some people are trying it. Okay, so I mentioned loan financing or debt financing. Now, who would be the type of lenders that you would go to? Obvious sort of like answer would be, well, let's sort of like start talk to a bank. Well, not really. With very, very few exceptions, banks are terrible at understanding how a game development business works. They simply don't get it. It will probably take another 10 years before they do. Venture debt is a bit more specialized. It sort of sits in between bank debt and venture capital. But we're not seeing it yet in games, and I don't think it's going to happen sort of anytime soon. And if it does, it will probably be for sort of like bigger projects. But specialized debt providers, there are a couple of them, and Triple Dragon is one. And yes, we are open for business, happy to lend to game developers, happy to lend to publishers. We understand the games business. We know how game development works. We know how painful certain parts of it can be. And that really helps because we can create something that is tailor-made for game developers so that they can finance development and particularly marketing and user acquisition. Just very, very briefly, I mentioned banks just don't get it. Why not? They will ask for your track record. Can we see your last 3 years financial statements? If you've been developing a game, you've been spending money, not really generating revenue, so your profit and loss account looks not that great, and banks will simply say no. So with specialist debt providers, what do we look at? We don't look at your last 3 years accounts, so that is fundamentally different. We understand how games work. We understand how games are being monetized. So we know where your revenue is coming from. If you're getting paid through Steam or through your App Store accounts, we get that. And we're comfortable with that. And that also means that if you're monetizing through platforms or through advertising networks, we understand that your money is effectively being generated by very, very large, very creditworthy businesses. So therefore, we can lend to game development studios because we can take security over those receivables, and that's how it works. And the end result is that by lending in that way to game developers, we can lend for various different purposes. And the main one that we see, and where this type of financing is really very effective for game developers, is user acquisition financing or marketing budget. I mean, as you know, these days, marketing and UA is a very, very large chunk of your operating expense. In most cases, probably several times larger than your development budget. But you do need to have access to that funding. And that is something that we can do with debt. So it's UA and marketing. In some cases, also sort of your soft launch marketing. You've developed your game, you want to put it in soft launch, but you don't quite have the budget to sort of like do a proper soft launch campaign. If we like the game, we'll sort of finance through soft launch. The other thing is what I call general purpose cash flow financing. If you have already some revenue in your business and you're working on your next project, and you still need a little bit more funding to sort of complete it, in those cases, we can also look at your existing revenues and say, well, you know what, that's a business that we can lend some money to. And if you want to use it for some development funding, fine. It doesn't always need to be for UA financing, so it can be for general purpose financing. And the last thing I put here on this particular bullet is, if you are lucky enough that you are working in a country where there's tax credits or grant funding, but as you will always see with those kind of arrangements, you get the tax credit after you file your tax return, and then it takes 6 months to get processed. If we understand how those procedures work, we'll say, okay, you know what, if the government is paying you $50,000 in 6 months' time, but you need the money now, we'll lend it now, because we can take security over that receivable. So there's quite a few options. But the main sort of like demand that we see for for sort of like our type of funding is pure UA financing, pure marketing budget financing. So what is it and how does that work? Well, it's a loan, and it's a loan facility that you would use for your UA. What I mean with loan facility, it's not, well, here's $100,000 or here's $200,000. It's you can lend up to, say, $250,000. If you need 100,000 now, you draw down 100. If your game doesn't really perform as you think it should, and you don't want to use the rest, you don't use the rest. If it scales up really, really well, you want to use all of it, you draw down, use all of it. So it's very, very flexible in that way. As I previously mentioned, we take security over App Store receivables, advertising network receivables, and that way we give you the opportunity to sort of like scale your game when it's appropriate, when your KPI, so your lifetime value per user, is well above the CPI, the cost per install. That's where you start to scale. And that can be very, very effective for mobile game developers. I mean, you could literally scale up sort of, say, start with a 25, 50K 1 month, and a few months later you'd be sort of like 150 to 250K level. So the profit and the revenue that you can be deriving from your mobile game can go up very, very fast. So what do you need to have? Well, you need to have metrics. You need to have reliable metrics. So use proper and good analytics software. Use software that we can get access to with dashboard access, because we want to know how things are performing. And also to give a little bit of guidance, these facilities are typically sort of around the 100K up to 500K mark, and it can go beyond that if the game does really well. So it's unfortunately not suitable if you say, well, can I have $20,000 for my game? That's not really worth the hassle, but these days marketing budgets tend to be fairly large, so it's not a problem that we've seen sort of like in practice, but do keep it in mind. And also, we'd like to work with game developers not just for a few months. We'd like to build up a relationship, and therefore we'd like to have our sort of financing facilities to be in place for at least 6 months, but ideally sort of like up to 18 months. And as I mentioned, this is loan financing, so we would charge a fixed monthly interest. In some cases, if we go in at soft launch stage, there would be some sort of rev share mechanism, but the important thing here is you're not giving away equity. If your game does really, really well, except for some financing costs, all of that upside is for you as a studio. One thing that you should keep in mind, though, is with UA, you need to have the expertise available in-house. We are financing providers. We're not doing the UA for you, but that means you either need to have that sort of like that skill set in your team, or look to expand your team. And in some cases, studios will say, well, we've got a game, we know it's good, and we've got some metrics, but we don't quite know how to sort of like do UA at scale. Or yes, we've tested with 10K or 15K and it worked. We're not comfortable we can do it with 100 or 200. Well, we know plenty of people in the industry who do UA either as a sort of like as a service, and in some cases there's also a few developers out there that have big UA teams that are not always at capacity, and they will do UA for third-party studios if we bring them to them. So there's external help available in the market if you need it. And the same goes with soft launch. If you're looking at soft launch and you need some funding for that, it basically works the same. It's usually a little bit smaller scale, and it usually sort of like steps up in smaller tranches. You don't spend 200K on a soft launch in the first week. You start with, say, 10, 25K a month, and then, okay, if it's working and you're getting the metrics that you want to get out of it, you continue and you slowly scale it up. And other than that, it's pretty much the same as regular UA financing. But It is a bit more risky for us as lenders, so we do look more carefully at the type of game that you're making and do we think it can monetize well. And that's simply to protect our own interest, but also for you guys as game developers. I mean, we don't want you to lend money and waste it and see no return or a loss on that. That's not going to help anyone. The other sort of like type of funding I mentioned, general cash flow financing. Again, 100 to 500K, and you can use it for pretty much anything, as long as there's security available in your business where there's existing games that are generating revenue, and we can sort of like take comfort that that will make sure that loans will get repaid. In that case, you need to have some games that are generating revenue, and this is something that quite a few studios sometimes forget. If you're sitting on games and you're already working on your next project or your next 2 projects, usually existing games in the portfolio do not get that much sort of attention anymore, and their financial performance starts to sort of like dwindle and goes down. Rather than it just sort of like sitting there, selling those games is actually a really good possibility. There's quite a few companies in the market that will buy all their games, even if they're relatively small. And the benefit is if you can sort of like get, say, $50,000 up front for a game that is no longer a priority for your business, that's 50K you can use for development funding to finish that new game that you're working on. So don't forget that. We get lots of questions about UA financing, and we love it because that's what we would like to talk about. And quite often it's about, well, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages of lending money rather than sort of like raising investment. Well, here are the sort of like the main sort of like pros and cons if you look at borrowing versus raising equity. I would say if you borrow the money, that's non-dilutive financing. So if your project, if your game does well, you're not giving away shares to an investor. All the upside is for you and for your company. I think another sort of like very major benefit of UA financing is it's pretty quick. We can do transactions in a matter of a few weeks, start to finish. Try raising money in an investment round. With a little bit of bad luck, you'd be spending 6 months doing roadshows, talking to investors, talking to investors, talking to investors, talking to investors. All that time you could be using to sort of make sure that you and your team are getting that game out there. So the time saving is really quite significant. The other thing is, it's very, very flexible. If you need more money, draw down on the facility. If you no longer need it, repay it. Imagine that you've raised, after lots and lots of time and effort, $250,000 to get that marketing budget, and you find out that the UA no longer scales and marketing channels start to get saturated. Not really a possibility to return it to that sort of like new VC investor you just got on board. With loans, repay it, bang, and you're done. Cost, that is sometimes said as well, yeah, but borrowing is expensive. Well, it's definitely not cheap, but it can be very, very effective as you really need to compare this. What is your alternative? Your alternative is raising equity. Raising equity, even though you're not paying interest, you're diluting yourself, that is potentially really, really expensive. And the other thing that we are seeing is companies love this type of funding to borrow before doing an investment raise. If you want to raise money from a VC and your revenue is maybe $50,000 a month, they're not going to be that interested because you might make a tiny, tiny profit. If you use UA financing for, say, 6 to 12 months, then all of a sudden you're now showing numbers of 300, 400,000 revenue a month, and you're actually quite profitable. You'll get lots of interest for a Series A round, and the terms that you will get on that round will be much, much better. So in those kind of scenarios, paying a little bit interest, or even a bit more than a little bit interest in that interim period, makes perfect sense. Well, we said pros and cons. Well, cons is it's not suitable for every studio or every scenario. The key thing is you need to have a studio that can sort of like do UA, not just develop a game, but also market it, unless you're able to sort of like get some external help in. So if this is something that you think, well, yeah, that sounds interesting. Maybe we should sort of like try to get some loan financing in place. Well, I mean, just a few pointers. Be realistic. I mean, people lend money, they want to see it back. So risk is being priced in as well. Don't try to compare this to interest rates that you see advertised on, say, a bank's website for, say, a grocery store that has been operating for 10 years or a car dealership. That will be very, very different. That's really comparing apples and oranges. And the other thing is performance is key when you're going to raise UA financing, when you're looking to scale UA financing. Sort of like the cardinal sin, if you're talking to lenders as well as to sort of equity investors, is game studios that leave money on the table. We absolutely hate that. We would like to see studios to sort of squeeze every penny that they can get out of their games. If you're not optimizing your advertising networks, if you're not optimizing your in-app purchase systems, you're leaving money on the table. Don't do it. No excuses. It's just silly. It doesn't make sense, and you're really hurting yourself. I mean, you become less credible as a business, and most importantly, it's your revenue that you're sort of like leaving on the table. So optimize where you can. As I said, we've come here to sort of like speak with developers, see their games, try their games. So if there's questions, please ask. The only thing as I said, I had sort of crypto on my slide, but I hate it. Don't get me started on that. So that's just one warning sign. But anything you would like to ask, please do, either here at the Q&A or come see me or come see Charlie afterwards. We're here today, we're here tomorrow, and love to have a chat.
Thank you very much. So if you have a question, please raise your hands. I knew.
Hi, thank you so much. So what is in general the interest rate?
We'll have a chat with you sort of like offline. It really depends on the circumstances. And yes, we'll have a chat. I mean, it's expensive, relatively speaking, if you compare it to other types of loans. But when banks are not lending and it's an alternative to raising equity, it's typically in sort of like what I call the venture debt kind of range, sort of bandwidth. But tell me a bit more about the type of game, the type of business, and we can give you some indication. It would just be wrong to name a number here that is maybe applicable to a few type of companies and not to everyone.
Any more questions? Okay, so I have a studio, for example. We're also doing game development, and we having our own internal marketing stuff. We're doing user acquisition. So what information should we provide for you to evaluate? Okay, what is the start point with negotiations can be from studio like we?
So typically it is really very simple for developers to reach out and say, well, hey guys, how does it work? We're interested. What we will do is we'll send you a short list with, can you please get us these and these kind of statistics? So we'd like to see some numbers on revenues. We'd like to see some KPIs on the game. So particularly lifetime value, and how is lifetime value being built up? In certain games, most of the LTV is being generated relatively early, maybe in the first month or the first 2-3 months. In other games, like RPGs, it can be much more sort of like pushed towards the back and spread out over a much longer period of time. So yeah, LTV and LTV curve, as we call it, very, very relevant. Your numbers on CPIs, how is that sort of like being built up? What channels are you using? And at what scale are you looking to do UA? That will give us a pretty good understanding of, is this a case that we think we can fund, and can we have a more detailed discussion about it?
So, because of this, I think that you are looking for studios for games that are already on the market, or you are also looking for studios and games that just in development or just on the last stages and looking for money. Like, for example, a lot of studios even do not have enough money for making like user acquisition tests.
Yeah, so for UA tests and soft launch, that is something that we can fund if we like the project, if we like the game. So that is a possibility. And even though sort of like our core business is UA financing, if we really, really like a game and it needs money for development, and we think, well, this is a game that should be made, and we think, most of all, it's a game that can make money, we will look at project financing and taking effectively equity risk or some kind of revenue share risk on that. But the game has to be pretty damn good, and we need to love it. But yes, we'll look at some project finance as well.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. How many projects you already funded? And another question, maybe it's a stupid question, but what if you give you loan money for user acquisition, like 50K, and we just burn this money, and our LTV is much less than CPI, and what we should do next?
Yeah, so we fund multiple type of projects. So it's games. We also fund some advertising networks, and sort of like as a yardstick, what we sort of like tend to sort of do is fund about 1 to 2 a month. Now, in your example, what if you draw down 50K and you burn it and something has gone horribly wrong? First of all, we would want to see a plan before you sort of like spend the money, and we'll do a sanity check. Well, these estimated CPIs, are those sort of like consistent with what we see in the market, or are these guys completely off? Now, also, we'd like to sort of like do some sanity checks on your LTV assumptions. Are those right? And yes, it can go wrong on the LTV side. If you're seeing decent LTV numbers in soft launch, but you start to scale up your UA a little bit too fast, or you start to scale into a channel where you're just not getting the right type of users, and that's possible, that's where things can go wrong. And that's why we'd like to have access to your analytics dashboard. So we can see on a day-by-day basis if the numbers are still stacking up. And if they don't, well, if you haven't seen that yourself, you're sort of like sleeping behind the wheel, if you like. That's not good business. You should not be doing that. But we'll be watching that dashboard as well. And if that happens, we'll be on the phone. Hey guys, what are you doing? This is not going right. Turn off the tap. So yeah, you may have spent part of that 50K in that scenario, but we'll keep an eye on that sort of like money is being spent wisely. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Looks like here is no more question. Thank you very much for a very interesting speech, Pieter.
Thank you.